Hello, everybody, and welcome to Security Dilemma. I'm John Allen Gay, Executive Director of the John Quincy Adams Society, here with my colleague, producer, and co-host, A.J. Manuzzi. We had a great conversation today with Daniel McCarthy, one of the leading conservative intellectuals out there, about American foreign policy, about Francis Fukuyama and the end of history, about the relationship between empire and the ideas of liberalism, about the rise of Trump, about Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilization. We really covered a whole lot of ground here, and so I'm looking forward to sharing this conversation with you. Before we get going, just a reminder to apply to the Society's summer conference for students and early career professionals. It's a really great opportunity to connect with peers, build your professional network, learn about U.S. grant strategy. I recommend you check it out on our website, jqas.org. But let's get to our guest, Daniel McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age, a regular contributor to the Spectator, and the former editor of The American Conservative, a magazine founded by conservatives opposed to the war in Iraq. So a very prescient movement that he's been a part of. So join us for this episode with Daniel McCarthy. So Daniel McCarthy, welcome to Security Dilemma.
Thank you, John.
I was going through some old stuff at my house the other day and found a 2014 issue of American Conservative magazine back from your days as editor. And the cover story was by you. It was called Why Liberalism Means Empire. It was a really well done cover, has a big red, white, and blue fist coming at the viewer. And I wanted to read a quote from it and get your reaction to it. You're reacting to Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis. What if Fukuyama was wrong and liberal democracy is not the end of the history after all? What if, on the contrary, the American way of life is an accident of history, one made possible only by a special kind of global security environment? What in fact has triumphed over the last 250 years, not since the Battle of Jena in 1806, but since the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, is not an idea, but an institution, empire. Successive British and American empires created and upheld the world order in which liberalism could flourish. Fukuyama's liberal democracy turns out to be a synonym for the attitudes and institutions of a world in which Anglo-American power is dominant. Tell us what you meant.
Yeah, in revisiting those remarks about 10 years later now, I would stand by them and I would maybe flesh them out by saying that, first of all, two things kind of set the preconditions for what we now call a liberal international order, but even what a century ago and more than a century ago was already a kind of liberal hegemonic situation in the globe, brought about by the British Empire and then continued by American hegemony after that. The first is that the success of British imperialism in the 19th century, and to some extent even earlier than that, created a great deal of prestige for the British national character, for British institutions, both internationally and domestically, which is important to keep in mind. So even the Americans after the American Revolution, in the very end of the 18th century, even we, you look at the debates of our founding fathers, look at debates of the framers of the Constitution. They were often saying, you know what, we've won our independence from Britain, but actually Britain still has the best constitution of any place on the planet. And they're the most successful, not only the freest, but also, in many respects, the most powerful and the most prosperous nation in the world. And so even we Americans who have just fought a war with the British will need in some way to imitate British institutions up to a point. At least that was one side of the revolutionary and the framing debate in the late 18th century. So the prestige that British power created for British institutions and British ideas was a great boost as liberalism develops over the course of the 19th century, because liberalism is seen as being almost a reflection of Britain's own institutions and Britain's way of doing things and Britain's way of thought. Certainly the inspirations and ideals of the Whigs who had been in power in Britain, in the lead up to the 19th century. They later become largely the Liberal Party in Britain. But these Whiggish and liberal ideas had a momentum and a amount of credibility that came from the success of British power and British wealth. And of course, the success of British power and wealth was not really a story of liberalism, right? So it certainly is true that British institutions, including free institutions, including British liberties, those had a very important role to play in building up British power. But so too did institutions involving the Royal Navy, involving impressment, involving the outright conquest, partly by actually, independent commercial entities like the British East India Company, partly by British military forces themselves. But there's obviously a story of coercion and illiberalism involved in the building of the British Empire, as well as a story of certain liberal components to it, which then gain a degree of prestige from this, illiberal project, or partly illiberal project. So that's part of what I was getting at, is that liberalism gains prestige both within America and Britain and also outside of the borders of those countries through the success of British military power and economic might. And those two things, of course, are very closely related. And then also, there is the fact that if you have a world in which the oceans are being policed by either the British Navy or now by American military power, then you have conditions in which piracy is going to be limited, in which competition between nation states on the open oceans is going to be limited. And those are going to be conditions that are conducive towards large scale international trade. And obviously, that is a very important cornerstone of liberal economics. And so you get conditions that are propitious for free trade out of these imperial conditions created by Britain and then sustained by America.
So that creates a natural question, which is, should folks who desire, small L liberalism in our society want to have some amount of American empire now? That if empire created this geopolitical space in which liberalism flourished. I mean, I think this would be one potential line of argument. Then sustaining freedom at home requires some kind of empire abroad.
Those are certainly the arguments that we hear from a lot of people who nowadays call themselves classical liberals, although perhaps a generation ago they might have called themselves neoconservatives or something else. That's a very popular line of argument. And it seems to me that in some ways, just as it was illiberal conditions or illiberal practices of empire that created the space for liberalism to flourish, and then liberalism comes and sort of puts its imprimatur on empires that already exist. And certainly this happens in Britain. There is sort of the white man's burden, this idea that the British Empire isn't just about conquering, other people in other places of the parts of the world, but rather that it's about exporting these wonderful British institutions and these British ideals. And of course, this has been magnified all the more under American hegemony. We say, look, we're not trying to take your land, we're not trying to take your oil. What we're trying to do is simply revolutionize your society so it can be more like us because we are the successful society. We are in fact the end of history, and that's kind of where Fukuyama is coming from. And there are, people today who say, look, in order for this process to continue, not only for the benefit of the rest of the world, must the United States continue to promote liberal democracy through military means if necessary, but also it's for the good of our own institutions, that these ideals are what make us great, these ideals are what make us successful. And in order to uphold those ideals, we actually have to make those ideals successful around the world. And that includes not only policing the oceans, but perhaps getting rid of dictatorships, getting rid of any kind of regime that is seen as being an obstacle to peace and a greater integration of trade and nations and peoples. So that's an argument. But of course, that argument, I think, first of all, neglects the extent to which these empires were built on illiberal foundations to begin with. And even though we in the Anglosphere, in Britain and America, think of ourselves in these heroic and idealistic and noble terms, that's not the way the peoples who have been on the receiving end of empire have ever looked at us, right? So Latin America doesn't think that the United States is such a good neighbor. Right now, Canada doesn't think the United States is such a good neighbor. India does not think, India has a complicated relationship. I don't want to say that there's nothing that the Indians admire about Britain, but the Indians as a whole generally do not say, hey, we miss being ruled by the British Empire, and we think it was appropriate that British civilization was placed on top of us in a forceful way. all throughout the world, and you certainly see this during the Cold War, where the West is successful in the Cold War, where America and its allies are successful in the Cold War, is when we are on the side of nation states that are trying to struggle for freedom against Soviet power. And you see that in Eastern Europe. But any place, especially in the developing world during the Cold War, where the Soviets were the ones saying, hey, we're the anti imperialists. We will help you against the people who have historically been your oppressors in China or in Indochina or in Africa or elsewhere. The Soviets actually had much more success. And what you got were not necessarily, direct Soviet controlled regimes, but you certainly had regimes that were native, that were communist, and that were aligned with the Soviet Union. And you see that throughout. So the liberals who now say that we should continue to have a hegemonic and imperialistic foreign policy for the sake of liberalism, both at home and also abroad, they're actually massively underestimating how negatively the rest of the world views this imperial experience under both Britain and the United States. And so I actually think that even though the ideological logic of what these liberals are saying makes sense, in practice, they're actually going to reap the opposite of what they're trying to sow. And by promoting hegemony, by promoting, a kind of liberal democratic imperialism, they're actually going to generate a huge backlash among the parts of the world that are growing, economically, that are growing in terms of population. The future really is going to be, in many respects, post-European, and these, other parts of the world do not look favorably upon the things that Western hegemony has accomplished. So I actually think that what you need now is kind of the opposite. You need to have, if you want to preserve the fruits of liberalism, you're going to have the places where it is strongest, such as the United States and Britain, be a little more careful about getting involved in other conflicts around the world, both because that generates resistance against us, it generates hostility against us, and hostility against our ideals, but also because here at home, the constant effort of maintaining these imperial institutions and projects, the national security state, the military apparatus, all of that is very distorting of our domestic Republican institutions in America. And the founding fathers were very, very keenly aware of this. The John Quincy Adams Society is named after, the son of a founding father who understood precisely, just as his father did, just as George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and others did, that America's institutions of self-government at home were not designed to administer a worldwide empire. And the attempt to do that, I think, is actually going to wind up being contrary to our own character as a republic. And it's also going to be damaging to liberalism, which is not quite the same thing, but obviously is something that can live in harmony with republicanism. And it's not going to live in harmony with the kind of empire we're trying to sustain.
Yeah, I think a lot about how America used to actually be very popular in the Middle East. We're talking like 100 or so years ago. People looked at the United States potentially as a liberator, as someone who could come and actively liberate them from the empires they were subject to. But there was a positive image among ordinary people, among elites there of the United States. And that was before we really were involved in this attempt to spread liberal values, liberal order into the region. And now, for trying, we are actually significantly less popular. And of course, I think, as you said, the folks in that region would not say, hey, America was just so eager to share its system of government and its values with us. But I wanted to zoom in a bit on that point about the founders, because as you were talking, I was thinking about Walter McDougall's book, The Tragedy of U.S. Foreign Policy, or maybe it's Tragedy of American Foreign Policy. I always get it mixed up with the William Appleman Williams book. But he basically argues that there's been a kind of vulgarization of the American idea about foreign policy away from this kind of self-government exemplar image to a global transformational image, and essentially that the foundations of how America thinks about itself have seriously shifted. I'm curious, like, do you think that we have the kind of constitution as a society to not do empire, to go back to being an exemplar?
Well, I think I'll say two things. First, to go back to one of your earlier points about America as an inspiration rather than as a controlling force, you're onto something very important there. That America was actually succeeding in promoting many of its ideals when we were not directly militarily engaged in places like the Middle East. And it was precisely because people looked at us and they said, America is an example of throwing off European control and creating new institutions at home and creating a republic for the people of America itself. Now, admittedly, a very flawed one, but nonetheless quite remarkable in the history of the human race. And this is something that other people aspire to. They said, if the Americans can do it, why shouldn't we be able to do the same thing? But they were going to do it for themselves and under their own local conditions. They were not saying, hey, we need the Americans to come over here, not only teach us how to do it, there was some of that, with missionaries and others, but we want the Americans to come in with force and actually, tell us, command us how to do it and create instability and wars basically in our country or our region that then, are supposed to somehow inevitably lead to liberal democracy when in fact the actual results we see are usually quite the opposite. So that's one thing I think you're exactly right about, that as an inspiration, we were more successful in promoting our ideals than we have been in a more heavy handed way of promoting them. The founding and the domestic institutions and the relationship between those and our foreign policy and whether we can go back. In some ways, it's not a matter of going back, but Walter McDougall, when he talks about US foreign policy, he says we had an Old Testament foreign policy and a New Testament foreign policy. The New Testament foreign policy, which is what we have now, is much more evangelical. It's universalistic. It's about trying to, export American ideals and institutions all around the world. Whereas our Old Testament foreign policy, which we had maybe up until the Spanish-American War, was much more about, that shining city on a hill and making America an example to the world, perhaps. But we would really be, as John Quincy Adams had said, the vindicator only of our own liberty and institutions. I think that the danger, I think there's a great deal of wisdom in what Walter McDougall says there, but the danger there is, of course, the Bible itself for Christians only has those two. It has the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's not a third testament after that. Whereas American history is an ongoing development. And I think actually we are getting to, as it were, a third testament of American foreign policy, because this New Testament foreign policy that McDougall describes, it was something which had its zenith, I think, during World War II and during the Cold War. It built a number of institutions which were designed to meet the needs of the hour. And now, as we are, more than 30 years after the end of the Cold War, practically 80 years since the end of World War II, those institutions are still around. Those institutions are still markers of prestige, and the most elite products of our best universities still aspire to be important figures within those institutions. And yet those institutions no longer have a mission that relates to the world as it actually is in the 21st century. In many ways, they are still trying to do the same kinds of things that they wanted to do during the Cold War, but couldn't do because the Soviet Union was a strong enough force that it could resist Western power. And again, the Soviet Union was a horrible, terrible thing. But what we see now is without having that kind of limit on us, our own hubris has become much greater than it was during the Cold War. And so the idea is, hey, let's keep all of these institutions. Now we can use them not only to resist Soviet power, we can actually use them to actively promote and rebuild and reconstruct the rest of the world. But it seems to me that the sort of high tide for that idea and the degree of relative power that America had to pursue that project has now passed us, and that the rest of the world is quickly rising. Changes in military technology make it much harder for America to capitalize on having superiority in aircraft carriers and fighter jets. But the rest of the world has drones. They have lots of cheap means of inflicting a great deal of damage on these much larger, things like aircraft carriers. And so I don't think the New Testament foreign policy is sustainable. And you also see domestically here in America, there is such disillusionment with the results of this evangelical foreign policy, this policy of trying to transform the world over the last 30 years, that there too, I think it's not sustainable in terms of public opinion. And even though on the surface it looks like public opinion is still quite favorable towards NATO and these many other, sort of long-lived institutions, I don't think that when people are actually asked to sacrifice for these institutions, that they're willing to make much of a sacrifice at all for them. Certainly you see that among our European partners, that they're all still very strongly dependent upon NATO. They want NATO to continue. And yet, if you poll the public in any NATO ally country, it turns out that members of the public, they're not even willing to fight for their own country and its borders, let alone fight for whatever NATO stands for.
Maybe it's just on my mind because I'm leading a JQAS reading group tonight on J. William Fulbright's The Arrogance of Power, and he has this chapter that he devotes to talking about revolutions and how America should think about revolutions during the Cold War, how our own revolutionary experience has warped our own thinking about U.S. foreign policy, how we interact with other broader movements around the globe. And this is a prevalent theme throughout U.S. foreign policy. I mean, going back to the sort of John Quincy Adams, well-wisher of liberty, but vindicator only of her own sort of ethos. I'm wondering how you think our experience with our own revolution impacted both the sort of Old Testament U.S. foreign policy as well as the psychology of the New Testament foreign policy.
Yeah, I think it's, very significant that you have this fundamental and very venomous division in America shortly after the success of our own revolution. You have a division over the French Revolution. And the question is the French Revolution a kind of continuation or sequel to the American Revolution? Will it produce, results as good as our own? Or is the French Revolution actually something that's very different in kind and is going to be very destructive? And the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans take opposite views of that question, and yet both sides see the dangers if America gets drawn into this international, basically this global conflict between the French Revolution and all of its more, in some cases, traditionally, monarchical, old regime kind of opponents, but also Britain, right? So, I mean, Britain's role, again, Britain had been seen as, in many ways, the most progressive and liberal nation on earth up to that point. Now the French Revolution is happening, and of course the British are opposed to the French Revolution, and they're very worried about it. And the question becomes: look, is liberalism, is whatever values Britain was seen to stand for, are those still best embodied by Britain, or are they now embodied by this new revolutionary regime, which claims to be for the rights of man and for liberty, equality, and fraternity? And Americans have to have an internal debate about that and where they come down. And it turns out that both sides, the Jeffersonians and the Federalists, they thought, however they might answer that question about the merits of the French Revolution, it would be a very bad idea for America to get drawn into that world war, either on the side of the British or on the side of the French. And it kind of helped as well that while Americans across the spectrum had a certain reluctance to get involved, they had an acute reluctance and a great deal of fervent hostility towards America getting involved on the side they were opposed to, right? So Thomas Jefferson, he didn't really want to get America into the war at all, but if we were going to get in, we certainly should not be supporting the British. So to the extent that the Federalists had sympathies with the British, the Jeffersonian Republicans in opposition said, we're going to stop you from getting too close to the British. And then contrariwise, once you have Jefferson in office, you have Federalists and the successors to the Federalists, some of whom have actually entered Jefferson's party, who are basically saying, look, you, Thomas Jefferson, might sometimes be enthusiastic about the French Revolution, but we really don't want to see America turn against Britain. We want to see more of a balance. So you wind up both with a certain underlying agreement about caution among American elites during the early 19th century, but also a certain conflict among these elites, where that conflict is actually helping to keep us out of foreign interventions, precisely because there isn't a sufficient consensus among the elite to say that we should either be on the side of the British or the French, even if we did want to intervene in a big way. And this kind of breaks down a little bit with the War of 1812, which was, a complicated thing. James Madison didn't think it was such a great idea, but there were members of Congress who did. Questions of basically the British were so tied up in trying to wrap up the Napoleonic Wars at that point that it seemed like, oh, this is a golden opportunity for us to take over Canada, which, as we see today, this is America's lifelong ambition. We're going to export the American Revolution. We're going to liberate Canada from the British or from its own institutions, from the Liberal Party of Canada, the legacy of Justin Trudeau. But this has been, it's why it's kind of not entirely surprising that you hear Trump saying the things that he's saying and Americans responding the way they are, some of whom are saying, hey, maybe this isn't such a crazy idea. It actually is a crazy idea, but it's one that Americans have entertained, for more than 200 years, basically. So I do think that, this change from the Old Testament to the New Testament foreign policy, it's much more about what's happening later in the 19th century. Americans are already, I think, in the late 19th century, very skeptical of the idea of French-style revolutions or eventually Russian-style revolutions. But they still have some degree of susceptibility to these old liberal anti-imperialist claims, right? So the propaganda that gets us into the Spanish-American War basically says, hey, the Spanish Empire is Catholic, it's monarchical, it's absolutist. This is not just Louis the 16th, this is Louis the 14th. And it's happening right here in our own backyard, and it's doing horrible things to the people that it's oppressing, throughout the Caribbean and then in the Pacific as well. And so America is going to act as the great liberator, the sort of bringer of Protestant values, the bringer of constitutionalism, liberalism, and democracy against monarchism. And of course, we fall for that propaganda, and then we find out what the actual results are. The results are, okay, so now we've thrown the Spanish out, but we wind up with all of these imperial possessions, including the Philippines, where we really have, basically it's like the Iraq War, the Vietnam War, our attempts to suppress the anti-imperialist efforts in the Philippines, because the Filipinos are now saying, wait a minute, we didn't throw out the Spanish just to have the Americans come in and do the same thing. And so, even to this day, we still have these imperial possessions like Puerto Rico, and they're in this kind of limbo. We have Guam, we have all these places, and they're in limbo because, of course, they're not states. They're not really fully integrated into mainland continental America's culture and economy and so forth, but they also are not independent. And so that was a lesson, but unfortunately, then you have a series of world wars in the early 20th century, which basically reinforced the idea that, the British can no longer maintain this world order that was so propitious for liberalism. And so if anyone's going to do it, it's going to have to be America. If there's going to be any hope for kind of liberalism and democracy as opposed to either Wilhelmine dictatorship or, Nazi dictatorship or Soviet dictatorship, that those are the alternatives that Europe is facing unless America comes in and counterbalances or defeats these powers. And then East Asia is presenting similar problems with the Japanese Empire and also with the growth of communism in East Asia. We get involved in this, and again, our experience is mixed. We're able to save Western Europe from the threats of totalitarianism, but we don't save, of course, Eastern Europe, which falls from Nazi totalitarianism into Soviet totalitarianism. We are able to keep Japan out of the communist orbit and to defeat Japanese imperialism. But of course, China, which is the biggest prize of all, is actually claimed by the communists, just as Eastern Europe was. So even the effects of World War II and the Cold War are not quite the happy ending that we like to tell ourselves. And the New Testament, unlike the Christian New Testament, which is going to end with a new heaven and a new earth and basically the second coming of Jesus, you have an end of history that is extremely good and beneficial. The end of the American New Testament has been, it turns out, just more conflict and in many ways the return of some of the same forces we were fighting much earlier in the chapters.
So that gets to another thing. I was reading another piece of yours in Modern Age, which, by the way, I commend to our listeners. That whole publication, it's one of the best intellectual journals out there, on Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations idea, which you've defended, and I think it would benefit our listeners to hear that defense, because that we have a decent number of political scientists on security dilemma, and often that work comes up as a kind of foil for what political science aims to do. It's folks say this is not rigorous, there's not sound methodology, it doesn't do what political science is supposed to do, that it's an example of bad commentary and bad analysis that people should kind of dismiss with a laugh. What do you have to say about that?
Well, the great French Catholic philosopher Pascal said that there are basically two ways of approaching philosophy and ideas in general. There's the spirit of geometry and the spirit of finesse. And unfortunately, I think our institutions, and this kind of traces back to their utilitarian mentality and origins, which is a long story, but they are very much fixated on the idea of the spirit of geometry, and that the way to do science, not only physical science, which is one thing, but also the social sciences, and even to some extent the humanities, that all of this should be subjected to the spirit of geometry, which is a spirit which requires strict uniform definitions and then understanding the relationship between those definitions. And we've seen this project in analytic philosophy, in the realm of philosophy. We see this certainly in the social sciences, all of which say, you have to define things in a geometric fashion, just as a geometric axiom requires, terms that are well defined and relationships that are, subject to a limited number of operations. This is also the way to understand social phenomena. And it is a way to understand some things, but Pascal said actually there is this entire other approach to knowledge as well, the spirit of finesse. And that requires tackling the things that cannot be easily defined. And these are very important things in our world, and they are all the more important among human beings and their interactions with one another. So I would look at the Clash of Civilizations, both as an essay and as a book and as a set of ideas, as being representations of the spirit of finesse and not the spirit of geometry. And people who can only appreciate the spirit of geometry are obviously going to disregard Huntington's works there. And Huntington himself, his background and training were very much in the modern American academy, which does have the spirit of geometry. So that was always a spirit that Huntington tried to formally present. And it was something that he himself, no doubt, saw himself as representing. But I think he's wrong. I think actually Huntington's most important insights come from this other side of sort of the insight that Pascal had about the nature of knowledge. So that's how I look at Huntington. And, in general, you can look both at some of the specific things that he says in the original essay version of The Clash of Civilizations and then the later book. You can look at specific things he says and also at the underlying thrust of the thesis in both of those works. And I think you'll find a great deal of merit in both of those, the specifics and in the general thrust, without saying that he's necessarily right about everything. And again, a friend of mine a few years ago did a very close reading of, I think, both versions actually of The Clash of Civilizations. And he was trying to mechanically apply, did Huntington get this prediction right or that prediction right? But he wasn't going deeper and saying, what is Huntington's actual idea here that is informing his predictions? And it's that idea that is going to be more important, right? So if in the mid 1990s or early 1990s, in the case of the first essay, Huntington makes a prediction about Ukraine, for example, not being a flashpoint for the Clash of Civilizations, that doesn't mean that Huntington would say the same thing if he were looking at Ukraine in the year 2000 or the year 2010. Huntington might actually make a different prediction based on the things that have changed, in the 20 years between when he's first writing and the period before Russia annexes Crimea. What Huntington says, as I recall, back in the early 1990s about Ukraine, is that Ukraine is a fault line between Western civilization and what he calls Orthodox civilization. But he doesn't expect Ukraine to be a flashpoint because he says the Ukrainians are not going to force the question. They're happy to be a land that has this internal division, and they're not going to try to go entirely in one direction or the other. And it seems to me that given that reasoning behind Huntington's conclusion, if you apply Huntington's reasoning to the direction of Ukrainian policy over the last 30 years since Huntington wrote those works, you would say, well, but in general, the Ukrainians have said we want to opt in a clear and decisive way for the West, for the European Union, for NATO, and for westernizing ourselves, and for breaking away from not just Russia's bloc, but from this kind of orthodox civilization, as Huntington calls it. And so I think the reasoning behind Huntington's predictions continues to be quite strong, even if the particular circumstances in which he was making the prediction, even if those have changed so that what he was saying in the early 90s is no longer quite right. You can also look, some of the things that Huntington says in passing in both versions of the Clash of Civilizations are really remarkable. So in the early 90s, he is already saying that the doctrine and the term weapons of mass destruction is going to be used to get the United States into a massive conflict somewhere around the world. So this is, he writes the essay version of Clash of Civilizations a decade before we have the 2003 Iraq War, which is all predicated on weapons of mass destruction. Huntington was already quite perceptive about how this concept would be used and abused to get us into wars. And then just more generally, I think, you can look at the trajectory of India, you can look at the trajectory of Israel, you can look at the trajectory of Turkey, you can look to some degree at the trajectory not only of Russia, but of many countries in Eastern Europe. And all of these show that you have nation states which are looking at themselves not just as rational actors or, nation states the way that realists might think of them, but actually do seem to be having this, certainly they are justifying new claims to expansion in terms of civilizational mandates. And it seems as if the voters and the public, sometimes they don't get a vote, but often they do, that the voters within these nations, they too see themselves as representing not just, a nation state with limited interests, but actually historic civilizations, which are tied in with religion and ethnicity and language and other things. So it's kind of nationalism, but it's not just nationalism. It's a nationalism that's escaping the bonds of nationalism and that is taking on, sort of wider regional influences, precisely under the cover of civilization. And you could say, well, all of this might just be a mask that a rational actor nation is wearing as a way of disguising what it's actually doing. But even if it's just a mask, it's still a very important mask and has real world consequences. And it seems to me if you take the idea of civilization seriously, then you are more prepared for these developments than a whole lot of not just Fukuyama readers, but a great many liberals and cosmopolitans and people who believe in rationalism, who were looking at the world in the late 90s and early 2000s and had absolutely no idea that you were going to see a resurgence of populism, of religious fundamentalism, of religion in Israel, in India, in Turkey. People who were thinking about civilization were much ahead of the curve in terms of where the world was going, relative to people who thought that civilization was too abstract, too vague, too meaningless to have real world consequences.
Yeah, and of course, the defining conflict for the United States in the 2000s was informed by civilizational difference, with the Islamic world and the revival of a certain vision or the creation of a certain vision of Islamic identity and of what the Islamic world should be led by, what it should be governed by, was behind the rise of Al Qaeda, certainly behind the rise of ISIS, and then led to all these conflicts. But let's bring it back to the United States here. The rise of Donald Trump and then his continued power within the Republican Party. I mean, he's arguably about a decade into being the dominant figure among Republicans. How has this changed Republican and conservative American foreign policy thinking?
There was already a interesting debate going on among conservatives and in the Republican Party about US foreign policy even before Donald Trump arrived on the scene. So going back to the 1990s, you had Pat Buchanan saying that basically we had made a wrong turn at the end of the Cold War, and that rather than becoming more involved in conflicts overseas, we should actually have been thinking more in terms of our own borders, our own national interest. And, with the Cold War over, we should no longer have these hegemonic institutions and ambitions. Then in the early 2000s, Ron Paul, who was a congressman, had a very well developed critique on libertarian grounds against US foreign policy, even before we get the war on terror and the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and elsewhere. So going back to the Persian Gulf War in 1991, there was already an interesting, very small but quite well informed and intelligent amount of conservative criticism of basically the George H.W. Bush foreign policy, the George W. Bush foreign policy, this idea of continuing to do nation building and democracy promotion all around the world, or act as the world's policeman, which was, kind of what we were called upon to be in the 1991 Persian Gulf War. This debate intensified as Americans, as conservatives and Republicans in particular, saw the results of following the Bush or the neoconservative style foreign policy. They saw that we were bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan. A lot of ordinary Republicans who hadn't thought about foreign policy very much, they were either, horrified by seeing Americans come home in body bags or missing limbs, or they were simply shocked on a political level to see that Republicans, had they were wiped out in the 2006 midterm elections, largely, in fact, because of foreign policy. They saw that the tide had turned against them, in 2008. And so a lot of Republicans, simply for reasons of self-interest or for the experience of their own communities and their own friends and family who had suffered in these wars, were starting to, have second thoughts about this neoconservative foreign policy. And they were starting to say, wait a minute, maybe figures like Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul were correct. And that didn't mean that they entirely embraced paleoconservatism or Ron Paul's version of libertarianism, but they became more open to that. And that you had a wider debate starting to break out in the Republican Party and among conservatives. The fact that a magazine like the American Conservative gets founded in 2002 is a sign of that. The fact that Ron Paul's presidential campaigns in 2008 and 2012 wind up having more grassroots support than anyone anticipated, that too is a sign of this development. But it's not an even fight though. And of course, even in 2008, John McCain, who is, who even more of a neoconservative than George W. Bush was, he becomes the Republican Party's nominee. Mitt Romney, who's nominated in 2012, is not that much of a change. But remember, Mitt Romney, of course, is defeated. And there's this talk, in the years between 2012 and 2016 of a so-called libertarian moment. You have Rand Paul, the son of Ron Paul, is then a senator. There's this idea that maybe Ron Paul's ideas fell short, in 2008 and 2012, but they could be the wave of the future for 2016. and that in fact this more realist and restrained view of foreign policy, which both Buchanan and Ron Paul had represented, that might actually have a future with Rand Paul and with this libertarian moment in the Republican Party. And of course, history throws us a curveball. It turns out that the libertarian end of history is also false. And instead, out of nowhere, apparently, you get Donald Trump, who is as critical of wars in Afghanistan and Iraq as Ron Paul had been, and as critical as Pat Buchanan had been. He's coming from a different perspective. He has much more of a, sort of aggressive real estate baron's view of the world. He thinks in terms of territory, he thinks in terms of assets and resources, and he says these wars we've been fighting have been a waste of our assets. They've not given us more territory, they've not given us more prosperity, and so we should never have gotten into them. So Trump, I think, he has impulses that coincide with those of restrainers and realists, and he has, also points of difference with them. And I think, at core, he realizes that most, not only wars, but also these ongoing alliances like NATO, they are ultimately going to be a drain on not just American financial resources, but also a drain on everyone's security because they are relationships of dependency, and those are bad. So Trump, I think, is quite right on those fronts. But of course, he also has these views, which he, kind of expressed in 2016. He says, well, look, if we were going to get into Iraq, we should have taken the oil. So obviously, that's not something you would have heard from Pat Buchanan or from Ron Paul. Likewise, now he's talking about, Greenland should really be ours. Canada should really be ours. The Panama Canal, really is meant to be ours. All of that is quite different either from what the neocons were saying or from what people like Ron Paul and Pat Buchanan were saying. But the effect of Donald Trump being president and being, sort of the guiding force now of the conservatives, of the right in America, and of the Republican Party, has been to enliven this foreign policy debate much more, to complicate it in some ways, but also to give quite a greater share in the debate and quite a more prominent seat at the table to people who really do want realism and restraint. And you see that with Tulsi Gabbard and J.D. Vance and others in the Trump administration itself. And you also see it in the effect that Trump has had on prominent intellectuals and social media voices, where basically the non-interventionist side, the realist and restraint side, is now more prominent among, I think, the rising voices on the right than interventionism is. And it's only these old institutions that in some ways were built during the Cold War and have this sort of post-Cold War hubris about exporting democracy and liberalism. It's only these older institutions that still reflect the kind of Bush and neoconservative mentality. And even many of the older institutions, like the Heritage Foundation, have changed very dramatically in the Trump years, partly as a result of Trump's inspiration.
You mentioned the '08 Ron Paul campaign, and you were actually involved with that campaign. Would you mind just telling us a little bit more about what that was like, what it was like to be a part of a grassroots movement with that was starting to reckon with some of the big issues that people on the trail were raising about our overzealous U.S. foreign policy?
I was enthusiastic about Ron Paul even before he began his 2008 presidential campaign. I thought, he was a very principled voice. I didn't necessarily agree with him on every point, but in general, he had certainly in foreign policy absolutely the right big picture. And so when he started to run for president, I thought this is a really good thing. He is the person who has, in all of Congress, probably the best views on foreign policy and restraint and realism. And yet I thought at the very beginning, well, but he's only a congressman. He's probably not going to get very far. This is an important thing for him to do and for me to support. But clearly, it's going to be a kind of a token form of resistance, and it's not going to have a changing effect, transformative effect on the party. And it turned out that, in fact, that was mistaken. And that, there was this debate, a presidential debate among many candidates in South Carolina in 2007. And South Carolina, of course, is a big military state. It's a place where you would not expect to find much anti-war sentiment. And yet Ron Paul basically directly confronts Rudy Giuliani, who's making the most hawkish arguments of all of the presidential aspirants. Ron Paul directly confronts Rudy Giuliani. He says that Giuliani is wrong. This is Mr. 9/11. This is Mr. Giuliani was the mayor of New York during the 9/11 attacks. And Ron Paul is calling him out right there on the stage, saying he's wrong about foreign policy. He's wrong about the war on terror. The war in Iraq is a disaster. So Ron Paul is doing these very brave and very very correct morally right things. And even his own campaign, I hadn't joined the campaign quite yet, but even within his own campaign, a lot of people thought, okay, this is suicidal. Ron Paul's doing the right thing and he has to do it, but obviously we're going to suffer tremendous damage from this in terms of, even running a token campaign that might get access to the debates, for example. And even Ron Paul himself has admitted, that he thought he had to do it, it was the right thing to do, and yet it probably was going to wind up playing very badly with Republican voters. And in fact, it turned out that voters were hungry to hear what nobody else had been willing to say. They were hungry for someone to say that the emperor had no clothes. And so Ron Paul wound up getting an enormous amount of support from small dollar donors who came out of the woodwork and started, boosting his campaign. And suddenly Ron Paul's campaign had funding to put it, if not on par, but certainly put it in the same ring or the same ballpark with your McCain's and your Mitt Romney's and your Rudy Giuliani's. So suddenly Ron Paul had serious financing, and he had at least, a chance of doing well in the polls, especially in a place like New Hampshire, it seemed. But in fact, New Hampshire wound up being a little more typically Republican and less libertarian than the Ron Paul campaign had hoped. And so when I joined the campaign, which was immediately after the New Hampshire primary, one of the things we had to deal with was a lot of our voters said, well, this has clearly just been stolen. They did not want to accept that there are a lot of normie Republicans in New Hampshire, and that, if New Hampshire didn't vote for Ron Paul, it was not because someone sabotaged the Diebold voting machines. It was because a lot of normie Republicans came out and voted for, these Bush-like Republicans. So one of the things we had to do is basically, not tell your own supporters, hey, how dare you have these thoughts about an election being stolen, but rather, the important thing to do here, you have to keep educating these voters, first of all, in order to get them to come over to your side. And second, you have to move on to the next battle. You have to look at, the South Carolina primaries coming up, Super Tuesdays coming up. If you're not, doing your utmost to win those fights, you can't be refighting the New Hampshire primary when you have the South Carolina primary coming up. You have to move on to the next battle. So that was one of the things I had to, communicate and educate on as a, basically the campaign's official blogger. We had to keep the focus on the battles that were coming up, not the battles that had already been, turned out less successfully than we wanted. It was a wonderful experience being on the campaign because it was everyone who had joined the campaign at that point had come on board basically before Ron Paul started enjoying this massive success with small dollar fundraising. And so everyone was completely green. These were not your usual Republican political professionals who attach themselves like leeches to any candidate that they think is going to bring in a revenue stream. Everyone was involved in the campaign for the mission itself. That was certainly true of the campaign's leader, Kent Snyder. You had kids fresh out of college, basically, running the financial side of things. And so it was wonderful because I think it would probably be comparable to maybe the Eugene McCarthy campaign in 1968, where you had all of these idealistic young liberals who wanted to get out of Vietnam joining Eugene McCarthy's campaign against the Vietnam War and against the Lyndon Johnson presidency. And similarly, you had all these idealistic people, and some of whom were not just, sort of starry-eyed idealists, but rather who said that we have done morally the wrong thing with, this massive project of wars all around the world. People, grassroots supporters and members of the campaign, they all had much more noble motives than you typically find in presidential efforts. So that was really, I think that's a unique experience. And it's not to say there's no, sort of benevolence or idealism in other political campaigns. Of course there is, but the professionals and the cynics and the Machiavellians are always the most prominent people in any other presidential campaign. And I think, Eugene McCarthy, Ron Paul in 2008, maybe Goldwater in 1960, perhaps even 1964. Those are the exceptions. And actually, to a weird extent, Donald Trump in 2016 was also something of an exception to that usual rule of the cynics and Machiavellians being in charge. Because, of course, all the political professionals in 2016 said Donald Trump is not only going to lose that election, he's going to lose it big. And anyone who's associated with him is going to be totally discredited. Any professional who's attached to Donald Trump is never going to work again in this town. And now, of course, that's changed. Now, unfortunately, not to criticize the Ron Paul movement, which I think generally stayed true to its, honest roots and its philosophy. But certainly the 2012 campaign did look a little bit different from the 2008 campaign in terms of more people saying, okay, there definitely will be revenue streams coming to the 2012 Ron Paul campaign. In 2016, I think that went even further. There were a lot of people looking forward to a Rand Paul campaign and saying, okay, we are political professionals who just like being professional Republicans, and we think that Rand Paul perhaps has a shot, and therefore we're going to attach ourselves to them. Similarly with Donald Trump in 2016, he was pure poison to the advisor class. One of the reasons Trump loses in 2020 is that a lot of those, parasitical advisors who just want to make money off a campaign, they say, aha, Donald Trump is actually a massive meal ticket. Whether he wins or loses, we're going to make a lot of money if we attach ourselves to his 2020 campaign. Sure enough, Trump defers to these people and they produce the same kind of results they produce for other candidates. Then in 2024, it's kind of a mix. By that point, Trump has kind of escaped the orbit of any kind of norm that exists in American politics. So I think 2024 and now are both, you've almost got a completely new set of kind of political advisors who are not the old guard, who are just, professional Republicans, but they're also not just idealists either. And that's one of the challenges of the Trump movement right now, is to see whether it can professionalize and wield power and win elections without becoming just a kind of cynical cash grab. And of course, we have seen plenty of elements of cynical cash grab that are involved in the Trump movement.
I want to turn to an article that you wrote earlier this week, speaking the last week of April. You discussed the nation of Georgia's strategic decisions after its invasion by Russia in 2008 as a potential precedent for Ukraine, with the war in Ukraine. Could you walk us a bit through the lessons that maybe we should draw from that parallel?
So, Georgia has, in many ways, stuck to its principles regarding the Russian invasion in 2008. So, basically, Russia invades in 2008. It is notionally backing independence movements in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. These are basically Russian, puppet regimes. They would not exist without, Russian influence and military support, in fact, and Russia has bases. And obviously, the Georgians had been aspiring to NATO membership before 2008. And Russia, takes a very dim view of its neighbors aspiring to NATO membership. That's one of the factors involved with the Ukraine war, and that was very much a factor also in the Russian invasion of Georgia. And the facts on the ground: Georgia is a nation of less than 4 million people, but faced even more overwhelming odds than Ukraine has faced against Russia. So that Russian invasion was very quick. Russia obtained most of what it wanted to obtain in terms of land and in terms of leverage over Georgia. What's interesting to me, however, and I've heard this from Georgian officials whose kind of realistic assessment of their position impressed me. The Georgians, they're not going to concede the legality of territorial changes that have been made by force. They say Abkhazia and South Ossetia, these are still parts of Georgia. And they're not going to concede to the Russian demands on those points of principle and law. And similarly, the Georgians, still want to have NATO membership. They have not said, because Putin will threaten us or Russia will threaten us, that therefore we will give up seeking NATO membership. I, as an American, don't see Georgia as something that adds to my security or the security of the United States if it gains NATO membership. But if I were a Georgian, I would absolutely be insistent upon trying to get NATO membership, because it would be the best chance my nation would have to have a shield against any potential Russian aggression or other kinds of foreign policy complications. So it's perfectly understandable why Georgians support accession of their country into NATO. So the Georgians haven't given up their quest for NATO membership. And yet the government of Georgia, under a party called Georgian Dream, which is quite controversial, even more controversial than Fidesz in Hungary and the current government in Hungary, which is disliked by European liberals. Well, the same people dislike Georgian Dream even more for many similar reasons. But Georgian Dream it's not a pro-Russian, pro-Putin party that has thrown aside aspirations of Georgia to join the EU or NATO or to reclaim its occupied territories. It is, however, the Georgian Dream Party and the government in Georgia has said, but we're going to put this on as long a timeline as necessary to see our goals have an opportunity of realization. So they're not, conducting a shooting war against Russia over these questions. And basically, they are just playing for time and accepting the de facto realities that are before them, while in principle and in law still saying, okay, but there is another level to this, and that level is where our claims should prevail. The path that this shows for Ukraine, I think Americans, and certainly this is partly true of the Trump administration, we look at the fact that Russia has a very tight grip on Crimea. Polls of Crimea, even before Russian annexation, show that Crimeans probably wanted to be part of Russia rather than part of Ukraine. So the prospects of Ukraine ever getting Crimea back from Russia seem virtually zero. And it's frustrating to us as Americans to see Zelensky throwing up objections to a peace proposal from Trump or from anyone else, because any concession of land, including Crimea, is simply out of the question for Zelensky and for the Ukrainians. Similarly, Zelensky and Ukraine do not want to give up on the possibility of eventually having Ukraine join NATO. And these, are things that the Trump administration sees as unnecessary barriers to doing a deal with Ukraine and with Russia. And the Georgian example shows maybe there is a way, and it's obviously not going to be easy, and it's going to be something where the Russians also, they feel much more strongly even about Ukraine than they do about Georgia, because their leverage is much, much weaker over Ukraine. But the idea that you can have claims in law or claims in principle that are different from claims over which you're actually going to go to war and fight, with bullets and with troops, that I think is an important, thing to observe here. And of course, that's true of conflicts between India and Pakistan. It's true perhaps, the conflict between the Koreas. This is a standard approach to dealing with these intractable territorial claims and claims about what a nation is free or not free to do in terms of its alliances. But not just that. One of the things that I perhaps didn't even bring out enough in my column is the attitude that the Georgians have towards this is, I think, the right one. It's a realistic attitude. It is a very long-term attitude. And, in the long run, the West is attractive to Ukraine and it's attractive to Georgia for intrinsic reasons, for reasons that the Ukrainians and the Georgians have simply as a matter of their own choice. Whereas Russia has to use force in order to get the Georgians and the Ukrainians to do what it wants them to do. Force has limits, and there's, you can only continue applying it for so long before it wears out and before conditions change, you're not able to apply it anymore. So I think actually the long run prospects for Georgia and Ukraine escaping the orbit of Russia are very good. But the short-term prospects, if they try to escape through fighting Russia militarily, are going to be very bad because Russia has an overwhelming amount of military force. So in the long run, I'm actually somewhat optimistic. Again, I think it doesn't make sense for America to have Ukraine or Georgia join NATO. But the long-run possibilities for Georgia and Ukraine integrating into perhaps the European Union, becoming more culturally westernized, maybe shifting civilizationally a little bit away from what had been called Orthodox civilization towards either Western civilization, or maybe in the case of Georgia, Turkey is obviously a very major player in their neighborhood as well. All of these things are very complicated, but I think that the Georgians and the Ukrainians are going to have much more liberty to make their own choices in the long run than they have in the short term facing a military conflict with Russia.
Yeah, I mean, you could certainly tell that story about Finland during the Cold War as well. They started out with the Soviets holding a controlled, closed military zone right near the capital and managed to end up, as part of some of the European trade arrangements. The Soviets left, things got better and better managed over time. And, Finland had a fairly short road into the EU after the collapse of Soviet power and eventually even joined NATO. And that was without kind of highly aggressive policy that you sometimes hear advocated from players out on the eastern flank with Russia, that essentially is maximalist and that wants to get everything today in the most coercive manner possible. All right, well, that's all the time we have. Daniel McCarthy, thank you for coming on Security Dilemma.
Thank you.
Security Dilemma is a podcast by the John Quincy Adams Society. To learn more about our programs, visit our website at jqas.org. Remember to rate and review on your podcast app and join us every Tuesday for new episodes of Security